Hello, 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 and welcome to another episode of Podcast Pasta. That's a podcast that's like pasta, not the podcast that's about pasta. As always, I'm your host, Mike, and I probably should have recorded this episode back when this topic was a little bit more relevant. But, for any returning listeners, you know that I've never really been timely with Podcast Pasta content, and I figured I think I still can tie this into like a general talking point that I want to like that I kind of want to tackle with the show for a while, but I'll just kind of use this as a bit of a jumping off point. But so a little while back ago, we had initial previews for like the newest Spider-Man animated series that premiered on like Disney Plus. I think the show is called like Your Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man or something. At the time of this recording, the whole first season has released, and I guess just as kind of a quick like review of it, I do highly recommend it. I did enjoy watching it myself. It does kind of harken back to the older Spider-Man animated show. I think that was like 90s or so, but with like a lot of like modern writing sensibilities to like kind of keep it fresh and especially keep like current audiences engaged with it. But no, I want to focus my attention on like the first previews that we got for the show, and in particular the response that those previews got. So it was like a video showing off like one of the first scenes in the series, and people immediately jumped on this show and started criticizing mainly like the animation, right? People saying that it looks terrible, that the background characters are animated poorly and everything like that. And I didn't really say anything at the time because I'm not insanely active on like social media. Even nowadays, I just like repost stuff from like people that I follow or whatever. But I don't know, like even those initial responses always kind of bugged me, and I think it was always for two reasons. One is that especially with like a lot of the criticism pointed at like the background character animation is that like dude, like any animated show, like good or bad, like the background characters are not really that well animated, right? And that is for itself, it's for its own slew of reasons. One is mainly like cost. Animation is still expensive, so you want to focus like, especially if you're working with like a limited budget, you want to focus on like animating that the elements that are important, which is like your main subjects, right? So like for example, like Family Guy, like or like a lot of Seth MacFarlane shows. They even made a joke about it in the context of a show where they say like, oh, like a lot of these background characters, like most of them don't even move and only some of them blink sometimes, right? So I don't know why this Spider-Man show got so much flack for that when other shows, you know, sometimes these other shows do the same thing too for similar reasons. Um, but even beyond that, like background character animation can sometimes play into like stylist. It's not just a cost saving thing. Sometimes it is like a stylistic thing too. Like sometimes you could like to emphasize a certain mood, you could like change how background characters are moving. Like maybe you would want them to like be more animated to emphasize like a different effect. So like but the most obvious reason is like it's similar to like live action like filmmaking where you don't want very active animated background elements because it distracts from like your subjects who you want to be the focus of the shot, right? So yeah, that's one, is just the fact that like every animated show like has like more, I guess I'll say, I don't want to say like bad. I mean, I'll kind of get to that later, but like more subdued background animated elements, right? But two, the reason why this whole criticism of like, oh, the animation looks bad, therefore the show must be awful, kind of rubbed me the wrong way, and it's kind of where I'm pulling the whole crux of this episode from, is that this is kind of a harder idea, I think, to explain, especially to, sometimes people that might not be, as acquainted, I guess I should say, with like animation. And look, I'm not like an animation major myself or anything. I'm doing this purely as like just somebody that talks about media and was lucky enough to afford a mic, like, podcast equipment or whatever. But no, this idea that I've kind of had with a lot of animated shows is that animation doesn't make or break a lot of animated series. And I know that's kind of weird to like think about, because like animation is the main expression of like, visual information in these shows, right? Um, but I think it's, while it is like, you can argue it is an important part, it's not like the only part that matters. And I would argue that there are like a lot of animated shows that, I think work even despite like bad animation, right? And granted, I guess also to defend your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, like watching the series myself, like the animation is not bad. I think there are even like moments where it does like interesting things with like its visual style and everything. I like a lot of the designs and stuff like that. No, not saying this isn't necessarily directed at your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. I'm just saying, like, in a broader sense, like even hypothetically, if like the animation wasn't like necessarily up to par in this show, I don't think it would have necessarily completely ruined the experience, because there have been plenty of shows that have had like, again, I hate to say like bad animation, because I don't know, I guess this is the postmodernist in me, but it's a very subjective scale. And I think like there's like this whole animation principle, and you could correct me if I'm wrong in the comments or whatever, but this whole animation principle that like even quote unquote bad animation in one context can sometimes be reutilized to be like good in another. For example, like a bad punching animation could be like a good slapping animation. So yeah, I think like in one context, like if you have like bad animation for like, let's say, a dramatic series, it could be like kind of retooled into something more comedic or whatever. The example I would give is like a lot of Adult Swim shows that have, again, quote unquote, like bad animation, but a lot of it is kind of made up for with like very humorous writing, or sometimes like the badness is kind of the point. The example I would give is kind of like Space Ghost, where it's like it's supposed to add to the humor because they're basically just recycling animation, and like you're kind of like made aware of that, and you're kind of like it's kind of impressive how much you could pull just from like recycled animation to make an entire series like that. But even outside of like recycled animation, you have like Aqua Teen Hunger Force, which is very crudely animated, but it's like a beloved show. I think it's like one of like Adult Swim's like top shows, right? But yeah, I also think like it doesn't even necessarily have to be just like, oh, bad animation for like comedic effect. I think there are like even more serious shows that have had that have nonetheless had, again, like kind of rougher animation, but that I think have still nonetheless been impactful. God, I wish I could remember the name of it. It was like kind of a Japanese animated series where it was like using rotoscope animation, and like a lot of the criticism of that show is that like the animation is rough, but it's really made up for it by like really strong, interesting writing. I wish I could remember the name of it, but it's eluding me right now. Whoever said I was good at my job, right? But no, but so it doesn't just have to be for like comedic animation. I guess if you want to stretch it a bit to like even web animation, I would also kind of point to like something like Salad Fingers, right? Which you could argue kind of has like a you could find like kind of a comedic angle in it, in the sense that some of the designs are like kind of humorous or whatever, but like it could even be used for like a scary tone, right? Because of with bad animation, sometimes like it's trying to mimic like how something moves in real life, but because it's bad, it kind of gives you that like uncanny valley effect, right? So no, yeah, I guess so again, I think there are plenty of examples of shows that have done well, even despite having like not amazing animation. Or you know what? I'll even throw a curveball. Invincible, the first season. I remember a lot of people criticized the animation in that, which, to be fair, a lot of that animation was kind of rough, but it was still like, but people still love it, right? Because it had such a compelling story and compelling characters. So what I'm saying is like even for like an animated show, like animation isn't the be all end all for everything, right? Um, and I don't know. This is kind of tangentially related, but I feel like this kind of point, I guess, with the aesthetics of like a property or something, it like is better. Like the idea of like you could have like quote unquote bad aesthetics, but still have an engaging experience is better understood in like video gaming for some reason. Where you have like this whole subgenre of like gaming dedicated to like capturing like, again, I hate to say like quote unquote like worse aesthetics, like PS1 aesthetics, but even like you have games like I don't know what you'd say, like Cruelty Squad, for example, where I don't think that's necessarily coming from like PS1 graphics. I think that's more akin to like early PC graphics ish. I don't know. I haven't played too much of Cruelty Squad, but yeah, like there's like this whole subgenre of like gaming or of like games, especially from like the independent scene, where it's like not going for like this hyper polished, realistic style, but that nonetheless is like loved either from like a gameplay perspective or like from a writing perspective. And I'm not sure why it's, I guess, more accepted in gaming to understand that like, oh, you don't need to necessarily chase a quote unquote appealing aesthetic in order to create like an engaging experience, maybe because you have the added element of like gameplay to like kind of supplant the visuals, whereas like if you're watching an animated series, it's just like the visuals are just, you don't have that interactive element, so it's just the visuals. um but yeah, and I don't know, it kind of feeds into like, at least for me, and again, this is kind of tangentially related, but like kind of this exhaustion that I've had with AAA gaming, where like you even like with these higher end, like for example, like Monster Hunter Wilds, which I have been enjoying a lot, but I've been finding it harder to like kind of play, I guess, in comparison to like more indie titles that I have in my Steam library, and I think that's just I don't know. I call it like, I've been, I guess, kind of taking like the Jacob Geller pill, right? Where Jacob Geller, video essayist, he's talked about like the aesthetics of games and sometimes how there's kind of this fault with pursuing. I think one of his essays was talking about this fault in pursuing um, like the AAA aesthetic, where you kind of leads it to this blending of styles where everything just starts to look the same. And I don't know, I guess I'm just finding myself exhausted with it, and that like the most fun I've been having in gaming these past few like months has been from like indie games. For example, like my favorite game of last year was weirdly enough Balatro, which is just video poker with gimmicks. um but I don't know, I guess maybe I'm kind of craving that too. Like I wish I could find something similar to that experience with like in television or film, where it's like, okay, instead of trying to chase like, and it's something aesthetically pleasing, which is like, I feel like that's the default with like a lot of as large studios like Disney or like Warner Brothers or something, where like, oh, we have this like high end animated movie or whatever, we have to chase like really visually pleasing like animation or whatever, right? Whereas I kind of wonder like I guess something like I'd much prefer like if they were to chase something interesting that might not appeal to everyone, um, than like something that you know. I mean, I guess I get as I'm talking about it now. I guess it makes sense why they don't do that, right? Like you have to appeal to as much people as you can for the sake of profit or whatever. So you know, you would. It makes sense to go for the most visually pleasing style versus like kind of animating, exploring like weird avant-garde like animation styles for shows or whatever. Whatever. I'm rambling. I'm sorry. I am tired. But yeah, I guess to summarize my main point here, I don't know. Even if an animated show has like a weird animation style that might not gel with you, I'd recommend giving it a shot. You might be surprised. But that is going to do it for me before my brain fries anymore. Thank you so much for listening, and you know, uh, you gotta eat the cabbage sometimes. Later.